Zoning is one of the barriers to entry, right? Another one is that there's a lot of build out because even a general practice have surgery suites. So the minute you've got a surgery suite, you're going to have significant build outs, right? And so those build outs make it harder to move. The other thing we love about veterinary, and I think you guys have done a lot of work in dental too, one of the things about veterinarians is they're incredibly passionate about being veterinarians, right? Most of them decide to be veterinarians when they're, 12, 13 years old. And so I always joke, we've looked at a lot of dental real estate and I eventually will buy some, but one of the big differences, I don't know anyone that went to dental school because they love teeth, right? And so the passion of the veterinarian it lends itself to a consolidation because even after someone's getting a big pot of gold for selling their practice, you've got a group of passionate professionals that are probably still wanting to practice, and that helps, right? Not that it doesn't work in other verticals. That plus it's also low regulatory, private pay. There's a whole bunch of things that we like.
Welcome back to Fingerprints on Success. Today's guest is Daniel Eisenstat, a visionary leader at the intersection of healthcare real estate and veterinary care. Daniel is the founder and CEO of Terravet Real Estate Solutions, a company that operates, develops, and manages healthcare real estate with a specialized focus on properties leased to veterinary operators. Before founding Terravet, Dan co-founded and served as president and chairman of Community Veterinary Partners, helping to grow it into a network of over 150 veterinary practices. Daniel's academic credentials are equally impressive. He holds an MBA from Harvard Business School, a law degree from the University of Virginia School of Law, and a bachelor's degree from Clark University. Beyond the business world, Daniel's work has a profound historical and cultural impact. He co-founded and served as the founding executive director of the Auschwitz Jewish Center, a museum and visitor center located near the former Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. His connection to this work is deeply personal. He is the son and grandson of Holocaust survivors. Dedication to preserving the memory of this dark chapter in history speaks to his deep commitment to education, human rights, and remembrance. Daniel's journey is one of entrepreneurship, impact, and resilience. You will love to hear the stories of the mentors that profoundly altered the course of Dan's personal and business journey. He's not only built a business empire, but also created spaces of healing, reflection, and connection for communities worldwide. His ability to blend business acumen with social impact makes him a truly unique leader. We're excited to dive into Dan's story today, uncover the lessons he's learned along the way, and explore the incredible work he's doing to shape the future of both healthcare and historical preservation. Let's unravel the fingerprints on success of Daniel Eisenstat. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Fingerprints on Success. So glad you could join us today. Today, I'm joined by Dan Eisenstat, who is the CEO and founder of Terravet Real Estate Solutions. Dan, want to welcome you to the program.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
No, it's great. And so, Dan, right now, as CEO and the founder of Terravet Real Estate Solutions, I know there's a journey that got you there, and you didn't just start in real estate because you came up with an idea last week. So, for the benefit of our listeners, tell us a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey and to get to this place where you are right now.
That's great. Thanks for having me. So, what I usually say is first, I was one of those kids who always was an entrepreneur from the early days on, shoveling snow and then selling floppy disks and software in the mid 80s. And then
wait a minute, for the younger members, you might have to explain what a floppy disk is.
Floppy disk is, you're right. You're right. It was before there was streaming, before there was digital, right?
That's right.
And ticket scalping before there was StubHub, right? And then in college, t-shirts and sweatshirts, and then I had a little toy business. So always doing something. I ended up, for a variety of reasons, deciding after undergrad to go to law school. And as we were talking earlier, the University of Virginia Law School. While I was in law school, when I ended up after law school, I ended up at Fulbright and Jaworski. But before law school, the year before I was in law school, I spent on a fellowship in Israel at Hebrew University. And one of the main benefactors of the fellowship is a guy's name is Fred Schwartz, may rest in peace. And his trade name, he's a great entrepreneur, trade name was Fred the Furrier. Fred was an incredible entrepreneur who built a fur business in New York inside of Bloomingdale's and took it public. And so Fred, my journey is really that Fred was the benefactor of this fellowship, and he showed up in Israel and he said, let a note out to I guess the 12 fellows and said, hey, I want to take you to dinner at the King David Hotel, right? So that's like the Four Seasons. So if you're 22, you're like, great, I'm there. So we go to the Four Seasons. Fred is a real entrepreneur, 100 ideas a day, 98 are terrible, one's okay, and one may just be brilliant, right? We show up and he's got a private room and he's got like maps and pictures up. And it becomes very clear to me that he's pitching, right? I don't know what he's pitching, but he's pitching, right? So I sit there and he basically starts talking about how he has this idea to create a Jewish museum near Auschwitz in Poland. And my mom is a child Holocaust survivor. My grandparents are survivors. And, he starts talking about this vision. And at the end of the pitch, the end of dinner, I walk up to him, I'm a kid, and I say, Fred, I think I get it in my gut, right? Because of my own personal experience. But like, this is complicated, right? Like it's post-communist country and Jewish Catholic relations, anti-Semitism, politics of memory. Like, this is really complicated. I said, do you know what you're getting yourself into? And he smiles at me and he says, I have no idea whatsoever. And he said, as an entrepreneur with, 50 years of success, and Fred had probably built a fortune of $100 million by then. He said, it's actually good that I don't know for two reasons. He said, first, he said, it's going to take twice as long and cost twice as much as I think. And if I actually knew, I might not do it. And he said, the second is more important. He said, the second reason is, he said, you come from an academic background right now. He said, so you think that knowledge is always good. He said, I'm here to tell you that as an entrepreneur, not knowing means that I also don't know what is not possible. And I have a broader view of what could be, and I'm uninhibited by what has been tried before. And he said, so we'll figure it out, right? And I said, that's really neat, Fred. That sounds like wisdom. I want to try and work out that with you. And so when I went to law school, I started working with Fred. And when I showed up at Fulbright & Jaworski law firm, I created a 501c3 nonprofit organization and took it on as a pro bono client. And then, I was a lawyer at a law school at Fulbright in New York for probably 16, 17 months. Fred shows up at probably month 14 or 15 and says, maybe 14, 15, 16, and says, hey, I just need 10 minutes. And it's a much longer story, but we had been lobbying the Polish government. We thought we'd get title of property. And Fred at this point's 70. And he shows up and he had also taught me about drip financing because I thought if the guy's going to put a lot of money in, he put in like $2,000, $5,000, like fair, right? Old school, right? And so he says, hey, listen, I just need 10 minutes. He goes, look, we can make this a reality. He said, and I know I've been dripping money in. I'll write $1 million check next week, but I'll be someone's got to be the sweat equity and it's got to go make it happen. I think you should take a 2-year leave from your law career and go work full time. He goes, and we'll figure out some salary for you and you won't make as much as you're making, but we can make it a reality. And he says, I don't want to be a jerk, but we got a little bit of time pressure. So it's Tuesday. You got to let me know by Friday. Right. So I go home to my then fiance, now wife of 27 years. And I say, hey, I saw Fred, and this is what he said, and I'm trying to decide what I want to do. And she was great. She called BS right away. She goes, listen, I know what you want to do, and you know what you want to do. Your question is, how do I feel about it, right?
Right, exactly. Right? Is it okay if
I
do what I want to do?
With your fiance, right? Right. So she said, listen, the thing I don't want to have happen is you be like 75 years old and saying would have, could have, should have. So go do it, and we'll figure it out. Right. God bless her. Right. So about a few weeks later, I was giving notice to the managing partner of Fulbright & Jaworski at the time, wonderful guy named Bill Bush. And it was the dot-com boom. This is 98. Right. So everyone was leaving to some .com.
Yep.
And he said, OK, I'm sorry you're leaving. Where are you going? Thinking I'm going to say, toys.com or something.
Right.
And I say, quote, the Auschwitz Jewish Center. Right. So he takes off his glasses and he goes, you think that's a good idea? Right? As in, you're committing career suicide, right? And I said, I don't know. I said, I think it's a good idea. That's what I'm going to do. So anyway, The long story, it's too long story really, but I basically left, and 4 years later, we'd done 5 real estate transactions in Poland, raised about $6 million, built a small visitor center and museum about 3 kilometers from the former concentration camp, hired staff, and it was at that point that for a bunch of reasons, said, "Hey, I've taken it where it can go. I'm going to go back to business school." One of the things I realized early into it was I wasn't going to go back to be a lawyer, right? And
Right.
part of the reason I wasn't going to go back to be a lawyer is I realized I had life experience of like a decade, but as a lawyer, my experience was pretty useless. I was still a second year, right? And
Yeah.
so anyway, I ended up going back to business school at Harvard. And I'm convinced the only reason I got into Harvard is because I was the only guy applying from the Aspen Stewart Center. And anyway, coming out of HBS, I thought, hey, I like building stuff. I'm going to try private equity, and I joined a kind of entrepreneurial wealth management family office private equity shop in Philadelphia. That's what brought me from New York down to Philly. Um, and I was there for about 5.5 years. Really learned how to do private equity deals, small buyouts, some growth investments. Did some real estate. It was a really interesting place. And then in 2008, when the economy started to sputter, a couple of guys and I were like, all right, our golden handcuffs are a little bronze now. If ever we're going to leave and do something, it's now.
Yep.
And we started trying to think about like, what could we do as a downturn's happening? This is the financial recession, great recession's happening. And we're like, all right, what doesn't get outsourced to China? What performs in a downturn? Where can our limited operating skills, but our deal skills be helpful? And we were all dog guys, and we're like, you know what? We'd seen another investor that had started to roll up animal hospitals, veterinary clinics. And we were like, I think we could probably do that, right? So we left, bought our first clinic in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And we spent one of the best things we ever did was we spent the first like 3 months, put on scrubs and, followed everyone around the clinic and then we put our own money in, we raised capital, we syndicated it. We over the next 3.5 years grew it to about 42 locations. And then the multiples of what you had to pay for practice started going up. Private equity, we were probably the sixth corporate group in the industry. And I know Mandelbaum does represent a bunch. So
we do.
By now at this point there are 60 or 70 corporate groups. We were number 6. And so as the prices started going up, we started realizing, you know what, the only way you compete here is to have a mountain of capital. So we ended up doing a process and selling a majority interest to a private equity group, the Cortec Group. We're great partners. At that point, my partners and I rolled. We stepped out of being day-to-day managers. I became co-chair. Cortec went on, put about 150 million into the business. We sold it also to Ontario's Municipal Pension Fund in 2019? No, 2020. 2020, we sold it for a little under $600 million, and I got out fully. Along the way, sorry, it's a long answer.
It's a great story.
Along the way, in 2012, I got a call from the third veterinarian with whom we partnered at Community Veterinary Partners, and we were buying the operating practice. We weren't buying the building.
Right.
And she called and said, she's in the Philly suburbs, and she said, hey, my kid's going to college, son's going to college. I think my husband and I want to sell the building. You gave us a lease. We own the building. And I looked at the lease, and there's a right of first refusal that says that, before we can sell it, we got to offer it to you. And she said, do you want to buy the building? And I said what any of us would say, which is, what do you think it's worth? Right? And she said, well, we just had it appraised for $1 million. And I thought that was an attractive price. And then we negotiated. I think I paid 1.2 million. And I went out and we put our own money in. We went to all our investors and we created a special entity and we bought the building. And at that point, a light bulb went off for me a little bit. And I thought, here's what's weird. There are all these companies now trying to buy the OpCo. No one's buying the PropCo. No one's buying the real estate. Now, to be fair, at that point in 2012, a lot of the real estate were converted houses and kind of crappy, but there were some nice purpose-built buildings. And my point of view was like, wait a second, maybe I should try and see if I can start buying the buildings here, right? And so over the next few years, I put together a small portfolio of about 7 buildings. And when we were exiting and selling to private equity, I carved real estate out of the non-compete and basically got very fortunate. An old friend of mine who was a private equity guy, had made a lot of money, started a family office, said he wanted to invest. And then my partner, Dan Feinberg, who had been at Marcus and Millichap and had done net lease real estate, he and I connected. And he thought I was nuts when I mentioned vet real estate. He had never seen it. And then I showed him a couple of buildings and he was like, maybe there's something here. And then we got very fortunate in the Pritzker family, Tom Pritzker's family office, Hyatt Hotel founding family, decided to anchor us and become our largest investor. And so we then raised an $80 million fund, which we've since invested and sold. We raised a $190 million fund, which we still own and invest. And we launched about 3 years ago, we launched a private REIT for a variety of reasons we can talk about. And so today we have some version of about $500 million of real estate, about 200 buildings in about 40 states, and we continue to grow, and the REIT continues to grow, and we've diversified a little, which we can talk about, which is we own about 10% of our rent comes from human ophthalmology and ambulatory surgery centers, and we've started looking at we looked at dental, we've looked at fertility, we've looked at a couple other sectors, so we're growing a bit beyond vet as well. So anyway, that's the story.
So yeah, so consolidation has been a very interesting thing. I mean, historically, yes, but I feel like in the last decade,
yeah,
private equity is just searching for verticals that they feel, match a certain model.
Yep.
And ripe for consolidation. And vet, I don't need to tell you, but maybe for our listeners, is an area that even when some of the other verticals have struggled, it has just seemed to not struggle. And at the end of the day, people are going to take care of their animals, which makes the underlying operating businesses strong assets. And the other issue with vet real estate is that in many scenarios, it's so important that the real estate is connected to the business because there's a lot of pre-existing non-conforming uses
Correct.
that allow for a veterinary operation to be there where they can't really move it somewhere because they won't be able to get the zoning.
Yeah, so you're totally right. Zoning is one of the barriers to entry, right? Yeah. Another one is that there's a lot of build out because even a general practice have surgery suites. Mm-hmm. So the minute you've got a surgery suite, you're going to have significant build outs, right? And so those build outs make it harder to move. The other thing we love about veterinary, and I think you guys have done a lot of work in dental too, one of the things about veterinarians is they're incredibly passionate about being veterinarians, right? Most of them decide to be veterinarians when they're, 12, 13 years old. And so I always joke, we've looked at a lot of dental real estate and I eventually will buy some, but one of the big differences, I don't know anyone that went to dental school because they love teeth, right? And so the passion of the veterinarian it lends itself to a consolidation because you even after someone's getting a big pot of gold for selling their practice, you've got a group of passionate professionals that are probably still wanting to practice. And that helps, right? Not that it doesn't work in other verticals. That plus it's also low regulatory, private pay. There's a whole bunch of things that we like. But yeah.
The other thing people don't consider when they compare those verticals too is that dentistry is a very physically grueling profession. Yep.
Imagine
the stress on one's back, the issues with hands, carpal tunnel, neck and back issues, and the stress that you are working. Literally,
I think you froze up.
We froze for a second there, and I was going to also add the stress that you're working inside someone's mouth all day, every day. So the longevity factor is just much harder. Whereas in veterinary, if you've got the passion and the love, it's not going to physically beat you to a pulp.
It's a really good point. The mix of things that a veterinarian's doing right? They're getting down on their knees and looking at dogs, then they're standing up and talking to clients, then they're going to go do some surgery. But it's not, to your point, it's not the same intense wear and tear of looking down, right? It's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that. It's a great point.
Yeah. I've been surrounded by, because as a corporate lawyer and fellow University of Virginia graduate, we got to give a shout out, wahoo, give a shout out to those Virginia fans out there. But you when you watch consolidation happen and you get to know different verticals, you talk so much with the professionals, you learn a lot about them and their lives, and it's kind of interesting. So I want to ask you a question about scaling, because what a lot of our listeners and the entrepreneurs that tune in, when they hear a story like yours, where this great story where you built this, but with your current venture, you've now built this to a very significant enterprise. What are some of the secrets to scaling? Because that is the thing that people find to be the biggest challenge, even when they've reached a certain level of success.
It's a great question. I think I'll say two things. There are probably many things, maybe three. One of the things I'll say is I think that we're very tempted as entrepreneurs to get distracted by the next good idea, right?
100%.
We love, because we're curious and we're creative and we like to tinker. And there's always something else that looks attractive, right? And by the way, especially when you're running a business, there are adjacencies, right? Like, I'll give you a perfect example. When we were running veterinary hospitals, one of the better adjacent businesses was the laboratory business, right? Think like a LabCorp or Quest, but for animals, right? And fecal samples and blood work, the margin is very strong. And we actually went and we bought a little lab. And it turns out that it's actually really complicated. It's a very different business.
Right.
It's a route business, there's quality assurance issues. And I would argue that we got distracted. And so one of the things I would say from a consolidation point of view is focus, right? And not allowing yourself to be distracted. When you figured out how to, either grow through organically or acquisition, organically is better, and you know how to do it, and you start to build confidence that you can do it, and you can build a team that can do it, you got to stay focused. So focus is, I think, one of the points. The second thing I would say is capital, right? And this is one of these where, I think that, and I certainly have not perfected this, but there's two ends of the continuum where I think you can make mistakes. One is raise too much capital too fast and get diluted too much, right? Mm-hmm. And the other, which I think is more often than not the challenge that entrepreneurs have, is don't raise enough, right? And be like, I want to hold on to 97.3% of my cap table, right? And like the reality is, this is like the three bears. There's a just right? And figuring out the amount of capital you need and making sure you have capital ahead. And one of the challenges is, we all, as entrepreneurs, we go through different economic cycles. There are cycles where, boy, it's easy to raise money, right? And then there's cycles where it's really hard. And right, so being very savvy about making sure you're capitalized to scale, right, is a second. And the third thing I would say is businesses that are high labor, a lot of people, are inherently harder to scale, right? Mm-hmm. Because while it's interesting, when we had community veterinary partners, when we sold to private equity, we probably had 900 employees, and 2/3, maybe more, 3/4 were probably hourly. There's always something going on, and always someone who's doing something, and mistake and challenge, and you end up, when you have a high labor business, you end up dealing with a lot of putting out fires, right? And so what's interesting when I contrast, and I think the really good operators of multi-site businesses or high labor businesses, they build a culture, they delegate really well, they build processes. And I'm okay at some of those, but there are people that are better, right? And what I found on the real estate side, the beautiful thing about scaling in real estate or finance is, right now we have 12 or 13 employees, depending on how you count some of our consultants, right? And yet our scale if you count my net operating income of rent, on my scale is significantly greater than it was when we sold Community Veterinary Partners. But boy, it's easy to scale when it's real estate or finance versus, that labor piece. So, for what it's worth, focus, capital, labor, three things to think about.
Yeah. Well, you have me smiling because I always say that my entrepreneurs are often like butterflies, and they get excited about one flower that they fly to. And then they say, whoa, wait a minute, this flower over here looks really good. And then they fly to that one. And I'm like, and as the lawyer who's doing the business, who's trying to like accomplish a result, I'm always like, wait a minute, what about this flower that we just started on? Now we're going to this one. Wait a minute, but you didn't give me everything I need to finish that one, know? And so, and it's hard to be a capitalist without capital, for sure. Yeah. So, very,
and I think the guys that I think we probably all are so impressed with as like entrepreneurial stories, right? The Jeff Bezoses of the world, right? Like, man, what the focus it takes and the conviction it takes to be able to say when the rest of the world is saying, really, books online? Like that's your thing? And for him to be like, no, it's not books online, it's everything online, right? And I think if you can do it, it's hard. The other thing that's interesting as we're talking about it, that I actually have learned in a couple of different entrepreneurial ventures now, is that in the early days, there are usually people that will poo-poo the idea, right?
Always
the critics, right? That like, well, what about this? I had, we left private equity to go roll up vet clinics. There were like 3 or 4 people, and I know exactly who they are, that said, "Oh, woof woof," or something stupid like that, right? Yeah. And initially when I started building our museum in Poland, when that happened, I got really like pissed off, right? Like, and then Fred Schwartz, who was really one of my mentors, said to me, he goes, no. He goes, listen, here's the thing. You got to treat it as motivation. And here's why. At some point when we're successful, some of those same people are going to come back and they're going to give you the attaboy. And they're going to say, I always knew you were going to be successful. And that's when you're going to get vindication, right? And so now when you get the people that are chirping from the sidelines or saying something inane like, oh, that's a good idea, right? Like as if the idea was the big thing, right? Versus the blood, sweat, and tears it takes to make it happen. But like now that's like a little motivation in early stages for me. So
yeah, it's interesting. Human nature, and one of the negative aspects of human nature I've found over the years is that the world is filled with begrudgers.
Yeah.
People, they want to hold on to your pant leg and pull you down while you're trying to do good things. And I've always wanted to surround myself. I'm actually in the process of writing a book right now about my father. One of the things I really admired about him and reflect on was that he loved success. Yeah. Loved it for everybody. Like if you had a story, I mean, he'd be riveted to your story. He'd be like, Dan, he'd ask you a million questions.
Right.
Because, and he'd be so excited and he'd be like, it was just incredible. And he just found it to be so fabulous when anyone did well, whether he knew you, didn't know you, met you for the first time. And I didn't realize that is a special way to think, because the average person is exactly like you described. And the entrepreneur, by definition, is usually a groundbreaker or someone who's causing interruption in a market or whatever.
Yeah.
And naturally, I remember when I went to become a lawyer, you know how many people were like, "Oh my God, you're going to be a lawyer?"
Oh,
and you're going to headquarter in New Jersey. Do you know there's 90,000 licensed lawyers in New Jersey? Right. And there literally are 90,000 license lawyers in New Jersey. And it never occurred to me that you couldn't build a huge firm and be wildly successful in the law. But there were so many people who almost like wanted it to be a failure.
Right. That's exactly. And it's interesting. I think over time we learn to surround ourselves with the people that are going to be energizing for us, right? Because the people that suck energy, boy, it's tough. The other thing that's interesting on reflection, there are a couple other little nuggets from Fred Schwartz. One of them was that in the early stages, I was very focused when we were building this museum on just making the right next step, right? Like figuring out what was the next thing we should do that would, and he said, stop trying to be so like careful. And I said, what do you mean? He said, listen, we need a lot of activity. He's like, we don't know at the standstill which is the exact right next step. So we need like lots of activity. And out of activity, we'll start to actually get momentum, right? And it won't be in equal measure. But once you have momentum, it's like riding a bike. It's a lot easier to turn when you're not standing still, right? It's like then you can actually pivot and move, but don't overthink that first step, right? Like that
Mm.
was like, which I thought was fascinating. And then the other one line that I always remember is there's a analysis paralysis that I think happens too, of like, right, I got to figure out what it is. And he used to say, you can only tread water so long. Eventually, you got to start to swim. And in some respects, it doesn't matter which way you start swimming, right? Like, because if you keep treading water, you die, right? And
Yeah.
so, anyway, those are early
Yeah.
stage stuff. But
Well, listen, law of proximity, right? You just want to be around where things are good or better,
yeah,
and watch what happens. And birds of a feather. You get around the right people
yeah,
and surround yourself with the right people in every aspect, and everything from building out a leadership team to
totally.
and everything that you do.
The other thing, by the way, that I was going to just reference, you made me think of
Sure.
it, was one of my favorite quotes, which you probably know, of Teddy Roosevelt in the arena.
Oh yeah.
The fantastic speech he gives about, right, which is great for
Right.
entrepreneurs, right? It's about like
The man in the
the man in
in
the
the
arena,
ring. Yeah.
right? And he gives it, and
Yep.
I think in the Sorbonne in the 19 maybe 10 or 12, and it's all about like, you know, whether you succeed or fail, you're at least you're going to be in the arena making a valiant effort versus the critics. And I think the line is who know not victory nor defeat, right? Like,
Right.
so it's a good entrepreneurial quote as a motivation if people are looking.
It really is. It's a great quote. So, what would you say, if you think about kind of, I talked a little bit about like a mindset like that my father had.
Yeah.
When you reflect on your success in building businesses, you think you had a certain type of mindset where you say to yourself, it's because I thought like this, or it's because I had this type of philosophy that I think it really made a big difference.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things, right? I think almost all these businesses that we start are fundamentally about people, right? Even the businesses that are low labor, right? And so I think that most entrepreneurs have to be motivators, right? And have to be able to gather people. And in some respects, I also think most entrepreneurs, not all, but most, have some ability, if they have conviction, to sell, right? Like, and I think that's probably where I lie. I'm more of a sales oriented person in particular, when I have conviction. So I think I like people. I want to build real relationships. And, I like, if I believe something, I have no problem, you know, raising the capital or selling you on the idea because I have conviction on it. Right. And so I think some of the early skills around sales, which, by the way, ironically, it's the only class in business that they don't teach in business school. Right. They teach
Interesting. Yeah.
marketing, they teach accounting, finance, right? But there's no, literally, at Harvard Business School, maybe there is now, there was not a single class on sales, right? Because it was viewed as kind of
Interesting.
like beneath, right? Somehow. And
Right.
yet you talk to
It's a
any
dirty
serious
word.
entrepreneur who's had success, and they'll tell you it's arguably it's top three, right? Because at the end of the day, right? I mean, as a lawyer, new client, this is so I think that's probably one of them. The other one I would say is, you know, I, I I like to believe that if you're fundamentally doing something you believe in and that is a decent thing, and you're going to build, have a level of transparency, you're going to build more authentic relationships. And like, truth is powerful, right? And so, I think that I think there's some people that underestimate the power of some level of integrity in how your right
Sure.
reputation and how you handle yourself. I think makes a difference, right? So I think I think those are probably two attributes, maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you tie it all together, really what you're saying is, and I believe this, is that life is still about people and it's still about relationships.
Yep.
And the other interesting point that you made too, and I find this with almost every successful entrepreneur, and my whole career I've dedicated to representing entrepreneurs. They almost entirely, not always, but almost entirely, are the best salesperson of their organization. Totally. Because it's their baby. They have the belief, they have the passion, and people pick up. I remember as I was building a law practice, and people were saying, "Wow, your practice is growing quickly." And by the way, in my profession, it's like saying the word sale is like a dirty word,
right?
Because it's a profession. Well, yeah, but nobody has legal work to do if someone doesn't convince right. someone else that you're the best choice, right?
I mean, that's right.
And I think when you have the passion for what you're doing and you're excited about it, the people you're interacting with, they feel it and they know it, and because it's real, and people are pretty good. The spidey sense on people is pretty good about whether you're full of crap or not.
Totally agree. And I would actually argue that I think there may be some people that are somewhat sociopaths that can fake it, but most of us can't fake it anywhere near as well. Is if we believe it, our ability, there's an authenticity to it, right? That comes across, right? And it's also interesting. Like, I think when you believe it, you actually stop thinking that you're trying to sell someone. You actually are convinced that you're actually helping them, right? Because, right, I fundamentally believe if I'm buying this veterinary practice, this building, I'm the best buyer for it, right? It's right. And if I think I'm going to make you money relative to your risk. And so, like, it's not like you're doing me a favor by doing this, right? And in fact, I always have thought if at any point I'm selling or raising money or trying to buy something, and I start feeling like, I hope he'll just do me the favor of doing it. It's like, well, hold on a second, right? Like, it's a terrible place to be, right?
Yeah. I always say to people, it's like I have a hero complex of sorts. Like what gets me the biggest thrill is being a hero to someone. Right. Like at the end of it, it's like I'm convincing you because I want to be the hero, and I think I'm going to be right. if you listen to me.
I agree with that.
So what wouldn't you do, right? So you don't get this far and say, Bill, every single thing we did, it was the perfect right decision. Yeah. Never made a mistake. And, sorry, I'm flawless. That's all I got to say. Yeah. What wouldn't you do?
I would say, we talked about it's a corollary, but like distraction is a huge thing, right? I got distracted in a whole bunch of things. Another thing that I would say I wouldn't do, and this is important, you need a level of trust with the people you're working with, your partners. Everyone's got people that they report to, with your investors, right? So what I found is when there's a breakdown of trust, it is so enervating. It sucks your energy. That I think people underestimate it. I mean, we've all watched probably people who've gotten divorced. And, my old partners and I, we separated, and thankfully we did it in a relatively amicable way. But, at the end of the day, all of those efforts, so I would just say I try and watch hard for myself to try and generate trust, because the minute you have that lack of trust, it's very hard to build on. Yes. I heard, it was interesting. I heard Robert Kraft, Patriots owner. I'm a Jets fan for what it's worth, so I hate the Patriots.
Me too. Season ticket holder since age 12.
Is that right? Yeah. Yep. By the way, I'm Yankees Jets, which is unusual.
Okay. It is unusual.
My dad was Yankees Giants, but my neighbor growing up was a Jets fan, had a season ticket, so I became a Jets fan. And as my dad used to say, may he rest in peace, it was my only rebellion, and I paid for it for the rest of my life. Right?
Yeah. so I'm right there with you. And my wife always teases me because she's like, listen, you couldn't have raised our kid to be like a Yankee Giant fan, instead you're a Met Jet fan. Oh, and then you couldn't, you had to pick the Rangers for hockey. So figure out that
I'm a Rangers fan too. Look at it. Yeah, exactly.
So, it's like, all the teams.
Devils. You could have had a great run with it. Yeah, exactly.
I could have had a great run. My kid could have seen a bunch of Stanley Cups already. Instead, nothing.
So you're probably with me. So I hate the Patriots, right? Oh, and there I am, right? So
no offense to all our listeners that are Patriots fans, but yeah.
By the way, the same way they hate, right? Like so I ended up in a small meeting, probably probably 40, 50 of us with Robert Kraft, and he was explaining sort of business philosophy. And he said something. He said, the only thing I can't abide is dissension among the key team. He's like, if you have dissension, he's like, it breaks down everything else. And it was interesting, like, and it was, that was, I think, apropos of why Parcells and he were not going to work, because they couldn't ever, he couldn't ever build that trust. And we think about, like, to be fair, and again, another guy, Tom Brady, like, he built this trusted relationship with Brady over a bunch of years, right? So anyway, I think that's probably, and I've made that mistake. I've tried at different times. I've probably been moving too fast, maybe too self-interested in my own success, maybe let my ego get in the way of, what works for me. And I think I've unintentionally, usually at times, created a lack of trust in key relationships that has bitten me and it's usually, at least from my experience, my own view, by virtue of my lack of focus or attention. It hasn't been intentional, but again, that's another way of messing up. I'm moving so fast. I'm so convinced I'm doing the right thing, and I'm not. And there's a lot of blinders, and I'm not seeing maybe the impact that I'm having on others. And if you're not attentive to that, and then you start having dissension or lack of trust, then that that has jumped up at me.
Yeah, it's interesting how the two tie together: the lack of trust and then the dissension, and which is logical, and then it's a disaster. And the football analogy is great. The only other thing I'll say about that whole football reference is, so I spent all those years as a Jet fan getting beat by Tom Brady, and just kept saying to myself, I just can't wait until this guy is retired or gone or whatever. So he finally leaves and he goes to Tampa Bay.
Of course.
And I'm bringing my son to the Jet game. And as it turns out, the very next year, the Jets have Tampa Bay on the schedule as a home game. So I can't escape Tom Brady. And I said to my son, I'm like, this guy, best ever, the greatest of all time. I said, you'll remember this day. You'll remember to say, hey, I saw Tom Brady. So anyway, the Jets were leading that entire game. And on the final play of the game, he throws a 40-yard dart in the corner of the end zone for a touchdown, and the Jets lose.
Totally.
And I said, oh my God, even when the guy left, I couldn't escape him.
I hate him. So I'll tell you my cute story about this is, for some reason, there are a couple of veterinary conferences that are the biggest conferences. One's in Orlando, one's in Vegas every year. For some reason, for a few years, the Orlando conference was over the Super Bowl weekend, right? So it's like, so I watched a couple of these. So anyway, the game that the Patriots came back, the Super Bowl against the Falcons, right? Right. I was watching in Orlando. Okay, great. About goal, greatest of all time, terrific. My next day, I had 4 meetings in a row, back-to-back half-hour meetings, and it just happened that from 8 a.m. till 10, they were all New England folks, right? Like, so every meeting started with, oh my God, the Patriots have and like my blood pressure was rising, right? So like my 4th meeting, so the guy who I'm actually pretty good friends with, and he's a good guy, he's a Boston guy, he's a great guy. And he like starts off, and there's like 7 or 8 of us in this meeting. And he starts off and he's like, Brady. And he's looking at me and he goes, Dan, listen, I know you don't like him and you don't like the Patriots, but you have to admit they're really good. And I don't know where, I think like my blood's boiling. And I literally say, and this is almost a quote, I look at him and I go, Ames, the Nazis were really good at taking over Europe, but I would never root for them. Right? And everybody goes, oh my God, what did you say?
And the room got really quiet after that.
I was like, oh, sorry.
Well, listen, I generally don't feel bad for billionaires, but I will never forget feeling terrible for Arthur Blank, the owner who, founder of Home Depot, owner of the Falcons,
who came down to the field,
who had his red tie on. I'll never forget it when he came down to the field, the excitement on his face. And I had actually met him. I took my kids to the ranch that he owns in Montana, which is a very, very small little ranch. They only take about 80 guests at a time. It's called Mountain Sky Ranch. Really cool, amazing place, 8,000 acres, incredible.
Wow.
And he's there vacationing with
Wow.
the guests the week that I'm there. So his
Cool.
favorite thing to do when they have the big night ride where everyone goes and they have like a party and a barbecue and a band, he serves all the guests pie. And so you get a chance to meet the guy, and he's dancing with his wife, and he's interacting with everybody, and he's serving the pie at dessert time. And I'm saying, this is like the nicest billionaire I think you could ever meet.
And everyone says he's a very related guy, from what I understand. Right?
Such a nice person. So now the Super Bowl happens, and I see this devastation on his face, and I feel like, oh man, I felt so bad for him.
Funny.
Anyway, I digress, but it's a fun digression for sure. So you talked a little bit about one of your mentors, and I love to ask about when you reflect on your life and success. Are there some people out there who you say, like, without a doubt, changed the course for you in a positive way?
Yeah. Look, I think the first couple are family, right? Which is not surprising. Like the first is really my grandfather, who was Holocaust survivor. Was trained as a tailor when he was 14 in Krakow, and lost my grandmother died in refugee camp after the war of complications with a pregnancy, and then when my mother was 5 years old. And so when I think about like the resilience to be able to like show up in America in 1949 with not a penny, right, and with a little girl, right, and then to build a life, right, and he was a guy who worked extremely hard, woke up 4 a.m, became the foreman of a factory. My mom became a doctor, right? I mean, that, true American dream. And one of the good anecdotes with my grandfather was when that year when I was practicing law, I got a call from him. It was around, Christmas, Hanukkah season, December time. And, it was a weeknight, and I knew, it's like 7:30 at night, and I know I'm there till like 1 a.m, right? Like, right. And I get a call from him. I answer the phone. Hey, Grandpa. He says, how you doing? I said, I'm okay. He goes, how are they treating you? And I said, before I could think, because I was probably like looking at me, I said, they're working me like a slave. Well, the second the word came out of my mouth, I was like, I'd like that back, right? Yeah. And he says,
reel that one back in.
He goes, son of a gun. He goes, let me ask you a question. They paying you? And I said, yeah, right there. Anyway, he goes, what floor are you on? He starts to like, right? Yeah. High up.
How's the view? How's the view out that skyscraper?
You got it. And then he goes, listen, he goes, I was a slave. Never complain about hard work. It's a blessing, right? Yeah. And that's like, that was an orientation. One of the things I think about our 3 daughters is, and even this next generation is, we were blessed, you and I, to have connection to that, that generation, which is kind of the greatest generation. Americans,
without a doubt,
worked their asses off, thought it was the greatest thing.
They built this country, basically. They built
the country. And in some respects, if I have some grit, some of it is, from my grandpa, right? And then secondarily, I would say my mom, who is a psychologist, and but built at some point in Westchester County, New York, decided she was done working for people, and she really motivated my dad, and they built a practice together and hired other psychologists and built it up. And so, also very hardworking. She was, she was atypical as from a gender stereotype. She was working really hard. My sister and I both, when we got to college, had the same reaction because, she always would put up, there was dinner and stuff, but she might be working till 8 or 9 at night. And so we never knew that you could make cookies from scratch. We always thought it had to come from a box. So like, that because she didn't have time, right? So, but those 2 are family. Fred Schwartz clearly had a huge impact on me. Was a kind of a, he drove me in many ways. He was not an easy guy, but had a big heart, really interesting, thoughtful about being an entrepreneur. And until he passed away, we had a close relationship. He also, another story with him, which I thought was an interesting insight. when I started right after, leaving the law firm and I started working with him, we had nothing. It was just the two of us. I was convinced that if we were going to raise capital, that I needed to make a really nice pamphlet, right? A brochure. And he's definitely not. And I said, no, we need a brochure. What are you talking about? He said, no, no, no. And I didn't really understand. Finally, what he said to me is, he said, let me explain why. He said, you're going to be selling. And he said, here's the problem. When, as a salesperson, you have a prop and a leave behind. He said, you're going to have psychologically the thought that if you're able to give the guy the pamphlet, that you did something. He's like, and in fact, you did nothing, right? He's like, so if we'll make a pamphlet when we actually have some momentum here, but until then, no pamphlet, because it's like, what's my next step? And if you think you get a pamphlet, like, so I thought that was fascinating in a way.
Interesting.
And then I got very fortunate a little later in life when I was in private equity. There was a guy whose name is Gordy Zacks, who's also an entrepreneur and a really great philanthropist who I met through a partner of mine, senior partner at the firm I was at. And Gordy was one of these guys who said to me after we first met, and he was probably in his 70s when I met him, 75, and he said, I'm going to become your mentor. And I said, okay, but he was one of these guys who followed up, right? And his big push to me always was, you've got a vision of what you want to do. You keep talking about it. Why aren't you doing it? Like, what's holding you back? And he was the kind of guy that would sort of, but he was a wonderful mentor, because he was sort of, and he and I didn't align always on politics. We didn't align always on a variety of things, but once he said he was going to be your mentor, and he did this, there must be 20 or 30 people that look to him in that way. And so, yeah, really very, very blessed. And I've tried, and maybe as I get older, I'll try even more to pay it back, to find some folks that I can try and help in that regard. But yeah, very fortunate, really.
Yeah. Well, that one guy that you just mentioned, Gordy, accountability, right? For especially for entrepreneurs, we often, especially if we're in charge of our own destiny, so to speak, very few people hold us accountable.
Yeah.
Because most of the people around you are going to be subordinate, and very few of those people will have the courage to respectfully hold you accountable.
I agree.
So that's a powerful thing.
It is. I got very fortunate. At some point, I got introduced to be in it's a really interesting group called YPO, Young Presidents Organization.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that YPO does is you go into a forum, which is a group of other leaders, and you meet once a month. And the model that's interesting is, because it's fully confidential, is everyone holds each other accountable a little bit, right? And that's a powerful sort of peer model, a little different than the mentoring model. But you're right, accountability is huge. So
yeah, I love the story about your grandfather too, because it was making me think almost exactly that. I had almost the same story with my dad, where I was sitting at that same type of desk like late at night, and I said, oh, he called me and I said, oh yeah, man, it's just brutal. It's brutal. I'm just getting, I got so much work to do, and I like pulling it. It's like, it's so insane. And I remember my dad going, isn't that great?
Isn't that great? Right, exactly.
It was like, and he meant it. Like, he was like, isn't that great? You're that busy. It's incredible.
Yeah,
and his perspective was, what? That's like the greatest blessing ever, that you're swamped. Like you have to work that hard. That's perfect, and it's like,
I recently, my oldest daughter is at college, and she's one of the editors of the school paper. And she recently called and she said, man, I'm just swamped. It's like I'm working a full-time job while I'm in school. And I said to her, you may not like this comment, but I said, really good practice.
Yeah.
Right? Really good training. Because
where's she going, by the way?
What's that?
Where's she going to school?
She's at University of Chicago, which is a hard working place. So
great school.
Great school. And so, but I thought, because I think our perspective as you get older and you have kids and you're balancing, right? Not a bad thing to have some training of, holding down a job and doing studies and all that. So.
Listen, one of the things I've said to anyone who will listen, I've said it on this show, I've said it, is that, again, reflecting on a career of representing entrepreneurs, I can really not think of any examples where the most successful entrepreneurs all have incredible work ethics. I have yet to meet one where I was like, like that really successful entrepreneur who built that huge company, he's like a 9-to-5er. Like that hasn't happened in my entire career.
I totally agree. And it's also why I think I said earlier, and I would have this conversation sometimes with certain friends and certain relatives too, where they would say, hey, I got an idea for you. Right. And, and you'd sit there and you'd think, I'm not discounting the value of a good idea, but and in particular, there's certain ideas that are better than others, right? If you're an engineer and you've got an algorithm, for software, great. That's an idea at a different level. But but even then, right, the difference of being able to have that idea and then actually put the work in to actually go from idea to opportunity, right, is huge, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, listen, there are a lot of people who have fingerprints all over your success.
Yeah.
So one of my challenges to you, and maybe I'll hold you accountable, is you have to find some mentees who could get the blessing of what you have to offer, the way those people did for you, because you obviously, have a lot to give, and I'm sure people would consider it an honor for sure. For sure.
Well, we found a couple. Try and find some more too. But yeah, hold me accountable to that. That's great.
Absolutely. So what's got you excited, Dan, about the future? When you wake up, and jump out of bed in the morning, what's got you saying, man, I'm pumped up about this?
It's interesting. Look, I guess it's a tumultuous time, right?
That's for sure.
But what I also think is that whenever there is the level of uncertainty in our world, there's also enormous opportunities, right? And so that's exciting if you're an entrepreneur. It's unsettling, but my wife always laughs and she goes, "You're like a change junkie." It's amazing we've been married for 27 years because you love things that are dynamic and changing, and so while I'd say there is perception that we're in challenging times, which I think we are. It's also times when fortunes are made, right, and when people find opportunity, because it also means that there's solutions to different areas of pain and challenges out there, right? And so I'm excited about. And I also would say, look, the other thing is, someone said to me a long time ago that the way that you really create a fortune at some point is to be someone who has capital when other people don't. Right. I'm not
Without a doubt
that that's fully me, but we're certainly well capitalized right now and feel good about that. I think right now is interesting from just a pure real estate point of view. If you and this, I'm not alone on this. This is not a novel idea, but it's been about 6 to 9 months ago. John Gray, who runs Blackstone and really originally ran Blackstone's real estate group, started saying, "Boy, this is a time to buy commercial real estate, right?" And the reason is it's out of favor, right? Everyone, whole bunch of folks and by the way, there's some real challenges, right? Work from home, and you got banks, and you got interest rates moving. And at the same time, his insight is, but if you really understand cycles, the time you want to buy is when everyone else is not, in the market. Right. So we've been careful. I think that's important. I think one of the challenges, I had an old boss at our investment firm who used to say, and I think it's also true, shit is shit at any price. Right. So
that's a great line.
Isn't that a good line? Right.
That is a great line.
The point being, in these moments where things get cheaper, right? One of the talents, I think, is determining what's a diamond and what's just crap. Right. I mean, This is a little bit, by the way, of the Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett dialogue, right? Where I think what Charlie Munger, one of his real contributions to Buffett's investing philosophy was Buffett was always picking up cigarette butts and cigar butts, right?
Right.
And Munger would say, listen, it's okay if it's a pretty, you don't need to just look for the cigarette butts. Like if you
Right.
find a business that's good, that's growing, it doesn't need to be a cigarette butt, right? So, but that's about finding quality. So I don't know. Those are some things that are going on right now. I'm excited about the NCAA tournament, although UVA is not in it.
No.
So
Yeah.
you know,
All my alma maters didn't make it this year, so I'm like a big ofer. So
but how good
I'm
was that run when UVA made it? Huh?
that was special, and I was lucky when I was at Boston College. My senior year, they went to the Final Eight, and it was a team that hadn't been in the tournament my entire time in school, and they were like they were thinking 11. They were a 10 or 11 seed, and they beat UNC. They beat North Carolina, who was the 1 seed. They beat Indiana, who was the 5 seed. It was like upset after upset.
That's fun.
So that was a good time.
And also, BC is the kind of like school, you know, because of the campus and Newton. Like when it happens, there's an esprit de corps, right? Like that's I remember I was probably a little older than you, but I vividly remember being in Boston. I was in high school, but I was visiting when Doug Flutie had the famous pass, right? Like
the Miracle of Miami, as we call it.
There you go. Miracle of Miami. There you go.
Well, that was, I was in I'm a little younger, not much, but I was in grade school at the time, like maybe like middle school, and remember watching that play live. Amazing. With my dad, and I remember watching the whole game, and it just probably one of the most incredible games ever, football games, because that people do, when they did the top 100 plays of the century, that was number 2. The Miracle on Ice for the 1980 U.S. hockey team.
Miracle on Ice, that's amazing.
That was
Miracle
number 1.
It's another great one.
The Miracle on Ice was number 1, and Doug Flutie's pass was number 2. But I remember, like, that kind of crystallized me as like a Boston College fan, and it became like my place that I wanted to go from watching that pass. And apparently I wasn't alone, because at that time, applications to Boston College used to average like, whatever it was like 12,000 applications a year. And it more than doubled the year after that pass.
Great. I recently we were at a wedding or bar mitzvah, and I met a professor at Davidson College down in North Carolina. And I know Davidson, and he said, do you know Davidson the same way as everyone else, right? Which is, where Curry went, right? Like, so, and so he said, we get more like young guys coming from the Bay Area, right? Because of, right. So like because of Steph Curry, and there's like a regular influx. And before that, like this little North Carolina school didn't get anyone from the Bay Area. So, they're,
which it's pretty incredible. Well, Dan, listen, I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I love your story. I love the stories about your mentors, the resilience of your grandfather. I mean, just so many great things. What a great journey it's been for you. And I hope to stay in touch with you and hear, how the next chapter and the continuation of the journey goes. Because, the best is yet to come. The bigger, brighter future lies ahead. And it's really exciting.
Agreed. Hey, listen, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun. And especially when we originally set this up, I didn't even know I had another UVA law guy. So that's good too. Yep,
that's right. We're going to stay in touch, because we have a lot in common. And listen, I'm going to need therapy to go through another Jets season, so I'm going to be relying on you.
Let me come. I'll come join you at a Jets game. Just let me know.
You got it.
All right.
Thanks again, Dan.
Take care. Bye.